Every writer knows that the best conversations about writing don't happen in classrooms or symposia or any other fancy artisanal setting. They happen at the bar, usually after deadline. That's the vibe we're going for here. This is The Other 51, Conversations with Writers About Writing. I'm Brian Moritz. Today's guest is Dr. Galen Clavio from Indiana University. Galen Clavio, welcome to The Other 51. Thanks for joining me today.
It's like I'm in a house that I live in, and yet all the furniture has been moved around into different spots.
This is totally podcast Inception happening right here.
Is it podcast Inception or just podcast incest?
Why'd you have to go there with that?
Well, I'm just saying, it's a little odd. It's great. I love it. I'm honored that I'm on here. It's just, it's cool. You know, it's like one of those things where it's like that Star Trek episode where they're like battling in between alternate universes.
Right. So yeah, this is different because Galen and I have another show together, The Flip Side, and he usually handles all the intros and the welcome to and setting up the episode while I just sit here in my basement and wait. But now we're flipped here, no pun intended. The Flip Side is on, so we do have a little news with that. The Flip Side will be coming back in late June.
Yes.
We've been on a hiatus since March due to various day job stuffs. And breaks from that day job, but we will be back in a few weeks talking our normal awesomeness. So
when you compare the hiatus like that Game of Thrones is on, our hiatus is nothing.
That's basically a good point. That's a really good point. But I did want to bring a little bit of the flip side to the Other 51 today. So do you have a flip side / Other 51 beer of the week?
Oh, actually I do. Let me look it up real quick. I had it this weekend, and I just want to make sure that I get it out properly. It's from a company called 450 North Brewing Company, which is out of Columbus, Indiana, and all of their like hazy IPAs are really outstanding. The one I had this weekend that I'll recommend is the Crystal Vision.
Okay.
It's a double IPA that does not taste like a double IPA. Like most of the time, you drink a double IPA and it's like getting hit over the head with a silk covered hammer. It's very smooth. It's not overly hoppy. And it's in that kind of hazy kind of New England IPA style that, I think does very well with those higher gravities. So I would recommend that. Really, any of their IPAs out of 450 North, if you can get a hold of them, are worth trying.
Very cool. So I can recommend this is out of a sampler pack, the Genesee Brewhouse pilot batch. They did a 3-pack of cream ales.
Nice.
Like the orange cream ale, the honey orange, this is one I brought to IAX a few months ago now.
Which was very good, by the way. My wife had it over the weekend.
I'm glad you guys liked it. So this is their Imperial Cream Ale. It's kind of like a combination of an IPA and a cream ale. So you got that smoothness, but a little more hot bite to it than maybe you would normally get on a normal cream ale. So it's an interesting flavor on it.
Nice. So,
we are, talking about, instead of our normal nonsense on the flip side, talking about kind of focusing on writing and our work and the stuff we're doing together and the stuff you've done in the past. So kind of start off with kind of if you wouldn't mind tracing your career path a little bit. How did you get to be, at Indiana, director of the National Sports Journalism Center and all that? Kind of trace your career path.
Yeah, sure. So I went to school with the plan of being a sports media person. I went and really had a broadcasting focus primarily when I started, and really stuck with that throughout all of undergrad. I did do a decent amount of writing during that time. I wrote for the school newspaper for a few semesters, and I also wrote for an embryonic blog. We didn't even know to call it a blog back then on the radio station site, where I was kind of covering things as they were going on. Worked in minor league sports primarily, doing play-by-play broadcasting, was also media relations, so I would do press releases, I would deal with media on a regular basis. Had a couple of stints doing radio as a sports director. So did that for about 5 years, decided to come back, get a master's degree, ended up getting a PhD, have continued to kind of write and podcast and do other things along those lines, like to kind of scratch the professional itch while I'm doing the academic stuff. Started a sports blog in 2007 that was actually pretty successful for a while, and then kind of got busy with other things. And then got to Indiana in 2009. I was at the University of Miami for a couple of years as a professor there. And then I've been at IU for almost a decade now, which is crazy to think about. And so, teach sports media here, and also coordinate all the programs. You mentioned the National Sports Journalism Center. I was named the director of that back in 2016 and have been trying to figure out the best ways to bridge the gaps between academia and industry ever since then.
What's the biggest challenge doing that?
Well, it's a couple of things. I think one is there's a lot of, I don't want to say cronyism because that's the wrong connotation, but there's a lot of like I trust other media people and those are the people I'm going to talk to. You get a lot of that when you're dealing with industry. And so if you're someone that people recognize from a professional career, they'll be willing to help you. And I actually run into that a lot on the broadcast side where people know me from having done broadcasting, and a lot of doors open that we're able to get our students through as a result of that. Maybe in some other areas, production, writing, things like that, not as much. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is, frankly, like trying to stay abreast of the newest developments, especially from a technological perspective. And, industry gives me a lot of great ideas to bring back to the school level. And then the problems you run into at the school level is that, like changing curriculum or even changing a syllabus is like really steering a battleship with your pinky. It takes a long time, and like stuff that should happen probably in weeks ends up take a year and a half, 2 years, sometimes more than that. So it's an interesting combination, particularly with an industry now where everything's changing so rapidly.
Well, and I've found that for me the biggest challenge tends to be the balancing act of kind of keeping up with the technological advances and the changes in platforms and what's used and all that versus, going too hard in on a single platform. Kind of the cliche I think that we can use in this space is, if you had designed your curriculum around MySpace in 2008, you'd probably 2006 really. But, if you did it in 2008, you'd be right in academia's wheelhouse. But I feel like there's that balance of how much do you teach a particular platform and like the tools and tricks and stuff for a platform versus like the bigger issues of like, so do you teach them how to be good on Twitter, or do you teach them how to like be engaged and like think of journalism on a social media level versus that specific platform deal?
Well, I think even more than that, it's how much do you define the roles you want them to step into? I mean, you just had that piece that you posted on your blog and we reposted on the NSJC website about, should I teach my kids how to write a game story? And, we debate that here. We debate, how much, like, do I want to teach my kids how to become a sports talk radio host, or do I want to teach them how to be a good podcast host? Because those are two very, very different sorts of things that have nominally the same type of talent skill set, I guess, at their core. Same thing with video. The only thing that everybody's been able to agree on uniformly is that everybody needs to know how to edit video. And then that's something that, even writers, writers need to edit video, podcasters, video people, whatever. Everything else, it's really up to the individual faculty members, I think, to interpret what they're seeing and where they think things are going, and then figure out what the best ideas are from that point forward. Everybody's guessing at this point. Like you, me, everybody, we really don't know where things are headed right now. And I think anybody that says that they do probably is trying to sell you a book.
So edit video is the standard. Why is how did you guys kind of realize that?
From talking to industry people.
Okay.
One of our alums, who was Chad Millman, who was the editor-in-chief of ESPN.com and is now at the Action Network, which is this emerging site that's focusing on sports gambling. I remember him coming up to me about a year and a half ago and saying, you need to tell all of your people that they need to be learning how to edit video. And that's something that I've heard from several other people in key areas, and I'm starting to get contacted by, newspapers asking me, okay, do you have people that can edit video? And, if they can write, great. If they can be on camera, that's certainly ideal, but we need people that know how to edit video. And I really think that it's simply because if you look at everything that's happened over the course of, let's say, the last 8 years, because I really think that 2010, we're going to look back on as the dividing line where, Facebook changed what it did and became more business oriented the year before. Twitter really didn't start to take off until 2009, and 2010 was when media members really started to glom onto it. Instagram was still a year away, but all the seeds had been planted. At that point, the visual nature of communication in this era, it's like when the technology caught up with it finally. And I don't think that's going anywhere. Like, until we're able to get images beamed directly into our brains, like through cybernetic implants or something like that, I think that video is going to be the pinnacle of information transfer in this particular environment. Not to say that writing isn't important, because it certainly is, because writing conveys depth and context in a way that video struggles to do in certain cases. But video is faster. It conveys a lot of things in a short period of time. And whether you're a Gannett site, or whether you're a local newspaper, or whether you're The Athletic or whatever, there seems to be a real demand on the part of audiences to be able to receive things from a visual perspective.
So, all right. So let's pivot to writing for a minute. See what I did there? Really, really bad inside sports media
it's good.
joke.
I mean, you got to take these things where you can get them, right?
Yeah, sure. So, especially because we're about the same age. So when you were coming up, I know that like writing was always like the core of my college education, probably your college education as well. And you heard that in classrooms. You hear that, we say that as professors, probably, whatever you go into, you need to be able to write. You were mostly a play-by-play radio guy. Really, how much writing do you do as a play-by-play guy as part of your day-to-day?
Well, I think that from the standpoint of when you're doing a game, it's more about language composition than about, writing in the strictest according to Hoyle format of it. And it's funny because I think that, the language constructional elements of writing are more important to some degree, because once you learn how words work together, that ends up making you better at everything. And it's why I think we stress it so much to students of any stripe, with the possible exception of production people, that writing has to be the foundational element. And I still believe that. From a play-by-play perspective, I learned that if I wrote out my intros, they sucked. They really sounded bad. They sounded like they'd been written rather than like they were coming off the top of my head. But the training that I had in writing and learning how to write and learning how to make things sound good when somebody read them certainly played a big part. As far as some of the other stuff's concerned, I mean, if you're doing play-by-play is a very, very specialized realm. But if you're doing sports broadcasting in the traditional sense where, you're doing score updates, or you're doing stories and things like that, stuff you'll hear on ESPN radio, that's all writing. You have to be able to write that stuff and deliver it in a way that's convincing and done in a broadcast style. And I think the one last thing I'll say on that, in today's era, when everybody's communicating through social media, the writing becomes even more important, because if you don't know how to maneuver 280 characters or a paragraph's worth of stuff on Facebook, you're going to really run into trouble, not just in terms of like the basic grammatical processes, but also just in terms of, how effectively can I move the people that I want to try to get to read or listen to this thing?
It's always amazing. I realized this maybe in the past year and a half or 2 years or so, because in my sports writing class, I tend to have a lot of our broadcast students. We have a smaller journalism program, but a really good sized broadcast unit. And I remember it was kind of an aha moment. It was maybe the third year I was teaching sports writing, but just how different broadcast writing is from kind of the newspaper writing that I teach. And that's not to say one is better or one is worse, but it was funny because I was always figuring out, like, why are my students struggling with story structure so much? And why are they always kind of defaulting to this chronological storytelling instead of kind of the inverted pyramid that we start with, or the thematic? Then it clicked, like, that's the broadcast style, like our highlight package. It's very chronological.
Well, and it's very much get to the point immediately because you don't know if people are going to continue to pay attention after the first sentence or not. I mean, that's one of the first things that I teach in script writing is like if you don't grab the audience's attention with the thing that is really important within the first couple of sentences, they're probably going to tune out mentally, if not physically. Now, I think that that's become less important with some of the forms of broadcast that we've got now, and to some degree, I've come to question the justification that a lot of that style of teaching rested on, from the standpoint that I really, having read a lot about television history and really radio history, I feel like we've given the public so little credit that a lot of what we assume the audience doesn't want is instead just the assumption, as opposed to there being any tangible evidence to back it up.
Like what?
The idea, well, like what I mean is the idea that if you don't get to the point right away, people will just automatically tune out. Yeah, there might be a focus group that says that, but I think that we underestimate the intellectual capacity of a lot of people. We dumb it down. I mean, famously, what newspapers are written at a 9th grade level and broadcast is written at a 6th grade level, or whatever the adage is. Big words, big concepts, and I honestly think that that's more of a managerial decision as opposed to being some kind of a requirement that audiences demand because they just can't handle anything more complicated than that. So I look at that and I say, all right, maybe we shouldn't be assuming those things. And then I look at it from the standpoint of, there are some things I think in broadcast that are good, and from a newspaper perspective or from just a writing perspective, I guess, because newspapers are the way we think about writing has to get out of that box of newspaper. There's nothing necessarily wrong with having stuff that gets right to the point if you can also provide additional context. And I think if people are interested in the story, they're going to read on and find important things, because even the newspaper conceit of, most important information first, regardless of chronology, even that was basically a gambit against people supposedly jumping to the next story or jumping off the page and thereby missing the advertising that we had, so artfully placed halfway down the story or something like that. So a lot of these assumptions I question, but I still try to teach the things that are there so that people know that those expectations will exist likely when they go out into the workforce.
So kind of moving on from your, from kind of teaching to your own writing, because you have been incredibly prolific in publishing and in terms of writing. Academically, I mean, and impressively, to be honest.
Thanks.
So kind of what is, and we can kind of play off of the study that we're kind of piecing together right now doing on The Athletic, but in general, like, you can talk about your research agenda in a little bit, but kind of what's your process? Like, how do you kind of go from idea to publication, and how does your research process tend to work?
Well, I don't know how much you've talked about research on the podcast before with people, but research writing and academic writing is very different from writing that you would see from a journalistic perspective. I mean, the core principles I think are similar. There's an objectivity that you're supposed to bring to the table, at least in quantitative research, like you and I do. But the processes are very different. I look at it like this: like when I get an idea, I just start writing from inside the piece. I'm not the type of person that starts at the intro. In fact, what I really do generally is I skip the introduction altogether, because that tends to be the biggest hang up for me, because I'm one of those people where if I try to organize it where, I'm going to write from the start and just go all the way through, I will constantly get caught up on what the best second sentence is supposed to be for the piece. And it's awful. So a lot of times I'll start with a review of literature. I'll start writing the methodology, because I will be able, once I get those things in place, to figure out how to better craft the beginning of the paper so that it helps to better introduce people to what I'm planning to talk about. The way that it generally works in academic writing is you have an idea, you come up with the research, you go back and look at the stuff that's happened before, you come up with research questions or hypotheses. Those spill over into the methodology, where it's like, okay, here's how I'm going to tackle this. Then you do the research, then you report the data, then you do the discussion, and you have to tie the literature back in. And for me, it's like you have to get that first section done first. So, you really have to establish what the antecedents were, and you have to establish why it's important. You have to establish who is affected, and then you have to figure out, okay, from that point, where do I go with it? And it's an interesting process because, I've gone into research articles, and all my research articles are on sports and media. I mean, basically almost everything that I've ever done has been sports and media, a lot of social media stuff in there. But, when I've done stories or articles in the past, a lot of times I'll start in one spot, and then as I start to write it, I'm like, wait a minute, I need to reconsider some of these assumptions that I've come in with, and then that will lead to me ultimately kind of changing my approach, at least as far as the intro and the lit review are concerned.
Yeah, that's kind of what's going on now. We'll go behind the curtain with what we're working on The Athletic. We presented a little pilot study that we did on The Athletic at the International Association of Common Sports Summit in April, back at IU. I posted a thing about it on Sports Media Guy. I'll throw a link to it in show notes. And we've been kind of going back and forth in the past couple of days on kind of moving it forward. And it's been interesting, and I've really liked this, kind of that questioning the assumptions and kind of seeing the piece kind of move from the very descriptive thing that we did to kind of that question of what does it mean and what's the kind of the big question driving it. And I think that's, I think for good research, effective research, I think that's that you've hit it. You've kind of got to get at that big question and not just kind of like, which is very rarely kind of like the first one that you come up with.
Well, and I think you also have to be cognizant of what the questions are. One of the problems I think that we run into, especially in media research, is that there's a certain expectation that just because research has been done on it, that's settled. It's like the case has been won or lost already, counselor, and so we need to move on to the next thing. And I don't always agree with that. When I first started, my very first research projects were always, they always looked at sports media through the lens of what was going on with technology, because I really felt that was changing the way that people approached things. And I got laughed at a lot early on. I'm not bitter about it. I understand the process, but my dissertation was on message board use, for instance, why people use message boards. Now, there had already been studies done on like online communities, but to me, there's a big difference between an online community that focuses on, some alt news group from the early 90s that, talks about, I don't know, movies or something like that, and what you would get in areas where there's a lot of passion, which is a lot of times what you get with sports fandom. Not to say that movie people aren't passionate, but it's a different kind of passion. Like there's a certain personal affiliation that you get with sports. And I think that, for me, I hesitated to hypothesize a lot throughout the first phase of my career, which was like 7 or 8 years, because I didn't feel like we knew enough to really draw a lot the sort of conclusions that would lead to hypothesizing. And I see it a lot in communication research across the board, whether it's sports or whether it's just general communication, where it's like you jump in, you look at it, and there's 4 hypotheses. Why are there hypotheses? Generally, it's because that's what reviewers like to see. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily, that's what's actually going on with the corpus of knowledge. It's like, well, I want to get this published. There's a pragmatism involved in it, which I get. Having gone through the tenure process, mm-hmm. I totally get it. But I don't really like it because I think it sometimes leads us into cul-de-sacs when it comes to how we think about these things. And I think that the writing really has to embody an intellectual curiosity about things that we don't always appreciate because, it's a numbers game like anything else. It's the same thing in journalism where, you might get one chance or two chances, to really drill deep down on something, but most of the time you're coming up with product, you're coming up with copy.
Right, and that's especially challenging for someone in my shoes, the junior faculty, not yet tenured, kind of that balancing act of wanting to do something really good and important while also, it's a numbers game, like you said. You've got to absolutely publish on that. So you mentioned that, a lot of your earlier research was kind of fueled by the sports media and the impact of technology on it. Is that still your big question, or have you kind of moved on to other areas?
I'm still interested in it, but not as much as I was at one point for a couple of reasons. One is that I feel like we're at a point where almost everybody is getting their news through social media. Even if you are a newspaper reader, if you're online, you're probably getting links to things, maybe things that you wouldn't have otherwise read, primarily through social media. And so that's a different sort of environment than the one that I was doing research in, where there was still a legitimate question about the people that were getting their stuff online versus the people that were still getting their stuff from traditional means. So to me, that changes the game in terms of the users. And to me, I've always been more interested in the users. I've been more interested in how do people receive the news? How do they process it? Rather than what is this institution doing? Or, how is this institution writing? What's the content in this? So that's part of it. The other part, though, is I've become increasingly fascinated with sports journalism questions and how sports journalism is operating in this new area where online is the dominant method of transmission. So now it's more about, all right, we know what the transmission methods are and we know how people are receiving it. Now the question is, how does that affect the media entities themselves? Did a study that got published last year with Ryan Voris, your slightly downstate colleague at SUNY Cortland, where we looked at ESPN and the whole stick to sports narrative and how, there's this whole segment of the population that views ESPN as hostile to their political views, which seems crazy to me. I think back to watching SportsCenter 20 years ago, and I can't think of a single person who was a sports fan who would sit there and legitimately say, I don't like this ESPN. It's hostile to my political beliefs. But that's where we're at now. Mm-hmm. So those sorts of questions have become more interesting to me. And I'm sure that'll change in another 5 to 10 years. I think that there's always a moving target when it comes to stuff like this. I think where you have to reevaluate constantly, not just what's out there, but also what interests you. I would hate to be a one-note person in this industry that just studied the same thing for 40 years.
Right. So kind of jumping a little bit, but I did want to ask you about the Bob Knight firing, because you were student media.
I was the sports director at the radio station. That was the beginning of my senior year. Yeah.
So what was that? I've heard you tell the story on other podcasts, I think, but for those of our listeners who haven't, what was that like for you as a student reporter and an Indiana guy growing up, an Indiana fan, an Indiana native?
Big Bob Knight fan too.
Yes.
There was not just an IU guy, but I was a big Bob Knight fan. And it's funny when I tell people that if they're not from Indiana, I kind of get the really sort of thing. Like you supported that guy. It was a different era,
right?
As I've tried to tell people, I never thought we'd get to a point in society where I'd look back on the 90s and say, man, that was a different time. but man, that was a different time. The number of things I went back. I've still got a lot of my old sports talk shows from college on tape, and God, they're terrible. And man, there's some of the things that get said on those tapes. I'm just like, oy, wow, I'm glad that didn't get out. I'm glad there was no internet back. There was an internet, but no one communicated with each other on it. So yeah, the Bob Knight thing, it was a different era. And as a reporter, the whole thing was fascinating because, we could kind of see the train coming down the tracks for a while, but I think everybody was convinced that nothing was going to happen that year. And then, there was that right before it was the weekend after Labor Day. You had the Kent Harvey incident, where he grabs the kid's arm. And then there was this bizarre press conference that we all went to. And, Knight came out, basically said all the charges were false and did this whole weird thing with a dry erase board where he illustrated what was going on. And everybody was kind of like, okay, I guess that's it. And then the story started to develop over the weekend. And we thought, actually, me and the other sports people at the radio station, we thought that there was a chance he might get fired at the trustees meeting, which was going to be the following week. And then I got a phone call that following morning, that Sunday morning, from a friend of mine who still operates one of the sites here in Indiana coverage, saying, well, I just got a phone call that said he was fired. And it was just this weird day where, you go in, I drove up to Indianapolis, covered the press conference where they announced the firing. That was like an hour-long thing. You're running around, you're interviewing players. You come back, and there's already people marching in protest on campus. And at one point, that crowd swelled to 4,000 or 5,000 people. And, and they're all over campus. They're knocking stuff down. There was a big confrontation between protesters and the police right in front of what used to be the McDonald's on Kirkwood Avenue. And so for me, it was a seminal moment as a reporter because I got to do everything that day. I mean, I went up and covered the press conference. I drove back. I went out into the crowds with a cell phone, like a brick cell phone, and covered stuff live. I remember standing in front of the president's house while they burned the president in effigy. And then, I went back, hosted in the studio for the last 6 hours or so of the coverage. I mean, it was a really, really crazy day. And it was an interesting thing because that was a big story. And for most of the national media, once that subsided, it pretty much went away after a couple of days. But for us, it was like a semester's worth of stories because there were all kinds of things administration-wise with the university that started to come out. There were a couple of lawsuits filed because of violations of open door laws and things like that. I mean, it was a crazy, crazy period. I flunked the first class of my college career during that semester because I was too busy covering the fallout from that story.
What's the best thing you've read lately?
Well, you're going to make me choose. Certainly that Brian Curtis piece today about the making of High Noon and both the perspectives of Jones and Torre and then the perspectives of the producer. I found that to be fascinating, for a lot of the reasons that we kind of opened this podcast with, like the shifting expectations of the culture and of media. But I also want to throw in a positive word for something that I posted on my Facebook wall yesterday, which was written by, I want to get the name right, by Stephen Godfrey, which is this whole twisted tale, basically, of the NCAA, violations that Ole Miss committed.
Oh, I saw you posted that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a long read. It's really well done. But those would be the two things that have been on the tip of my tongue the most the last couple of days.
And I'm going to throw a nod out there. I can't believe I forgot who wrote it for the Ringer. But the Brian Colangelo burner cell phone story that came out a week ago as we're recording this. I mean, we almost broke embargo on the flip side for a special edition of that. That was just it was just
Ben Dietrich, by the way, is the writer's name.
Thank you. And that was the story that, like, as you read it, it just got crazier and crazier and crazier as you went going. Like, he did not do the like inverted pyramid where he led with it. Like, he built it and all till you were hooked, and then that was insane.
Yeah, it's funny. I thought it was a great story. I thought it was really well reported. I was talking to somebody online about it. Like we talked about how important that piece is for the Ringer. I mean, that could be their Manti Te'o hoax story, basically. Mm-hmm. But I was not overly shocked by the piece. And I don't know if that's just because I've become a cynical bastard in my old age, but everything as I was reading it, I was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm not shocked by this at all. And to me, it was not a leap at all that a high-ranking executive, especially in the NBA, being such an image-conscious league, would employ multiple burner accounts, either directly or indirectly, to try to, basically cushion his spot as far as media perception is concerned. So I thought it was a great piece. I just personally wasn't shocked by it.
Well, I mean, part of that, I'm sure, is you've studied social media for so long. You're so in that. You're much more deeper into that world than I think a lot of people are. And I imagine part of the reaction, too, is just that it was a Colangelo, and they have such the name is so kind of deeply embedded into the NBA, and a lot of, like, the NBA media is very friendly with him. And so I think that was kind of more of the shock. Not just that this happened, but that this kind of, like, perceived basketball royalty would do that. And the fact that it's the Sixers and involves Embiid in the process, and, Sam Hinkie was probably the leaker. It's gold. All of it is gold.
No, it's true. And I mean, yeah, if it had been, the Sacramento Kings, if it had been Vlade Divac that had been doing, I don't think it would have the same sort of buzz. But, the NCAA, the NBA is such a it's such a gossip and soap opera driven league, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but for the most soap opera-ish franchise arguably that they've got right now, top to bottom, to be so heavily embroiled in it was almost too perfect of a matching of things.
And now I'm just kind of thinking what Vlade Divac's burner accounts would be.
I mean, if he's on Twitter, like I feel like that's a step up for him at this point. I mean, I don't know. The Kings are just a fascinating case in like a franchise that only matters when something goes wrong because you never hear anybody mention them otherwise.
Right. Galen, if people want to find you, follow you, see what you're up to, where's the best place to do so?
Probably on Twitter, although me and Twitter are kind of seeing other people right now, but it's at Dr. GC, DOCTORGC. You can also go to mediaschool.indiana.edu/NSJC, although you'll see most of Brian's stuff there because I'm on a little bit of it. We're doing a lot of restructuring behind the scenes. I haven't had a chance to write or podcast much lately, but those are the two primary places.
And at Flipside Pod coming later in this month for season. Are we up to season 8 on that nonsense already?
Is it 8 or is it 7? I've forgotten. Let's check. We'll ask somebody. Get the intern to give us that info.
All right, this has been fun catching up, and thanks again.
Yeah, man, thank you.
As always, thanks for listening to The Other 51. You can find show notes for this episode and all our episodes at sportsmediaguy.com on the Other 51 tab. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. I can highly recommend Overcast for this. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.